So in today's video, I want to talk about how do we address such queen attacks like the one we have on the board right now on the b2, or if we flip the colors, the b7 pawn. And I believe this is important to address because this is something which can arise in many different openings, such as in London that we have on the board right now, where we've developed our bishop off of its c1 square, and in doing so, we inevitably make our b2 pawn a little bit soft, which can give our opponent this opportunity of targeting it and asking white some serious questions very early on in the game. But nonetheless, in today's video, I want to share with you guys the different methods of which you can use to cope with this queen attack, when they are good, when they are bad. But without further ado, let's get right into things. And so in this position, to start off with, a very common move, especially in the Lee chess database I've noticed, is for white to play this move b3. But the thing I want you guys to understand is that very rarely is it a good idea to move your pawn like this in the queen side because of the sheer amount of weaknesses it creates. Sometimes in the worst case scenario, this diagonal gets very weak and your opponent can give checks, for example, with a bishop, and concretely you can end up very close to losing straight off the bat in the opening. At a more mild level, however, and this is quite likely to happen, is that your opponent may eventually exchange, and then eventually when you want to move your c pawn, let's say to a square like c3 to protect this pawn as we see in the next move, well, now in the long term what you're going to have is this issue of a sort of weak c3 pawn, because again you move this pawn to b3, whereas if your pawn was back on b2, the pawn chain would be more secure as a whole, and you wouldn't have this sort of long-term issue to worry about. Unfortunately, however, as the famous saying goes, pawns do not move backwards, and if we continue down the line a couple more moves, we can see how eventually this weakness of the c pawn will come back to bite us a little bit, where black is improving their pieces. Their rook is now in the c file, potentially targeting this pawn. And another weakness that this pawn move is induced by, once again, going to b3, is the a3 square, which means that if white ever brings a rook to, say, c1, for example, then it can get kicked around by a move like bishop a3, which is, again, very annoying to deal with. To really consolidate this in your guys' mind though, here's another example in the Slav Defense, where this is another opening, right, where black very often develops their light squeeze bishop outside the pawn chain very early. White might play queen b3, and in this position black's best move is to probably play something like queen c7 or queen b6, but say in this example they play b6, white takes on d5, and this is a very common way of trying to exploit very early on the weaknesses that accompany this move b6, namely like for example this diagonal where they can soon give a check on b5, and after knight bd7, you might be thinking, okay, it's not too big of a deal though, black might be able to, develop their bishop, castle, get their king to safety, but there's a very nice move in this position which exploits again the fact that black has this slightly awkward development where they've weakened the light squares a lot, namely that in this position white can actually just play e4, and it looks pretty radical at first because we can take it in 3 different ways, but the whole idea is that regardless of how black decides to tackle this move e4, we're going to play knight e5, and then bishop g5, and essentially we're overloading them on 2 different diagonals. Bishop takes f6 as our threat next, and then we're going to take knight d7, very little the black can really do about that. The second way you can sort of defend against these sort of early queen attacks, however, is by using a rook to defend the pawn, as in this position where we can play a move such as rook b1. Again, b3 is very weakening, I think it's best we avoid such a move, but rook b1 in this position does the job, keeps our sort of pawn structure intact, and we can continue developing with pretty standard moves of the London system. However, one thing you have to be careful of when you play such a move as rook b1 is, say if we go down a similar looking line where now queen b6 is played, in this position you can't play rook b1 because black actually has not yet played a move such as e6, which means they can just play bishop f5, kick our rook out, and not only is this going to mean we lose a tempo, but more importantly we just lose a b2 pawn and we have very little compensation to show for it. Looking at another position from the Slav Defense, however, I want to talk about this position briefly where white plays queen b3, and it actually turns out in this exact position bishop f5 is a mistake. We'll talk about briefly why that is soon, but first of all I want to examine this position after queen b3, now queen b6, and these sort of pawn structures where white takes on b6 like this. And this is very important to understand when in these sort of situations, right, we use our queen to defend the b7 pawn, because generally speaking when white takes on b6, white takes on d5 like this and we take back, the b5 square is quite problematic. White very often might just place a knight there in the long term, start harassing us, whether they quite get a knight c7, fork our king and rook. We probably won't allow that, but nonetheless it can be quite annoying in many circumstances. And not to mention there's also the possibility they might put a bishop on the square one day, and that can also be a little bit annoying to deal with. However, while generally speaking this sort of structure is not desirable for black, I want to show one famous game played by none other than the great Jose Capablanca, where in this position after a takes b6, c takes d5, he did not play c takes d5, but rather he played knight takes d5 c5, and the whole idea is that now after this exchange, this is an improved version upon the structure we just looked at, because we exchange off this pair of knights, which means that because, for example, very often, like we were just talking about, knight b5 can be often sort of taking up an outpost on that square. Well, because we exchange these knights, that is no longer possible. And furthermore, what Capablanca did on the next few moves after e3, knight c6, bishop d2 was he played this move bishop d7, going backwards with the bishop, which is really strange upon first sight. But the whole idea is he wanted to cover this diagonal, namely the b5 square, to prevent any sort of, bishop coming to b5 and being very active and annoying. And the rest of the game was very instructive, but I'll only briefly flick through it, where we had bishop e2, e6, fairly normal moves, bring a rook to the c file, eventually we go knight a5, knight c4, now knight c4 I believe. White caved into the pressure they took, but then we could undouble our b pawns finally. We get in b5 later, and this is of course a very good position for black. Capablanca also started some play up on the king side, and he later went on to win a very nice game. However, that sort of mini discussion aside from like this structure being generally a little bit shaky for the black pieces, but this sort of exception where you exchange a knight, that is actually quite nice for black. It's important to understand that if we say insert these moves e3 and e6 both sides, and say we insert this exchange with c takes d5, black should play e takes d5 so as to avoid this sort of thing where, again, we don't really want to go into this structure, but actually play e takes d5, because now if white takes this rather, a takes b6. If we briefly compare this and this position is a lot better for black, because we sort of have this one pawn island as a whole, and also if we notice the role the c6 pawn plays, it covers the b5 square, right, which was a problem in all those other lines, and it also allows us to eventually, or maybe very soon, play something like b5 and maybe even b4 to gain space on the queen side, sort of harass the white pieces. And for that reason, this position, black is probably already on the verge of just being better. However, I was talking about earlier, right, how this move bishop f5 is just really bad in this position. And usually in the Slav defense, what you want to understand is that with a knight on c3, so early on like this, it usually is not a good idea for white to play bishop f5. In these lines, for example, where white plays f3, bishop f5 is a little bit more acceptable, because again, if queen b3, queen b6, now if white does a similar thing, there's not enough pressure on d5 to really capitalize on any concrete opportunities, whereas in this line with bishop f5, immediately white can take first, c takes d5, now queen b3, and if queen takes b6, a takes b6, white is a little bit better positionally speaking, but there's an even stronger move in this position, where they can actually just play knight takes d5, and now if takes, white is just upper queen pawn, and if instead of knight takes d5 you go queen takes b3, again also upper queen pawn in this position due to the intermediate check knight takes f6 of course. And so for that reason, say if you play the Slav defense for example, you have to be quite careful about actually playing moves such as bishop f5 very early on, because it might turn out that you just have no good defense to white taking first and then going queen b3 and attacking the b7 pawn, because again you don't want to go b6, because something like knight e5 and like e4 could occur with some very similar tactics to what we were just looking at earlier. Another element you need to be aware of when you sort of defend against these queen attacks like queen b6 is that when you play a move like queen b3, very often what your opponent will do is play a move such as c4. And you have to be very wary of the sort of arising structure where if you take on b6, this is already maybe a bit dubious, because now what you're allowing is your opponent, okay, you're technically giving them double pawns, but you're giving them this very easy plan to play for of undermining your pawns and making progress on the queen side with something like b5, b4, maybe exchanging this pawn and then running the other b pawn forward, which is why in this position the main move after c4 is for white to actually play queen c2, but then black has another very nice move playing bishop f5, gaining the tempi, because now if queen takes f5, queen takes b2, we're going to be winning some serious material, which forces them white to make another passive retreat with the queen, and then black usually plays some move like h6, making sure that knight h4 always gets met with bishop h7, and say if like knight bd2, e6, bishop b7 castles, black has a nice base advantage, and white always has to be careful of playing a move such as b3 attacking the c4 pawn, because black might be able to play a move such as queen a5, beating takes with bishop a3, and all of a sudden this queen could end up in a lot of trouble. For example, after queen d1, queen takes c3, there's a lot of sort of dangerous threats that are sort of lurking in the position. And it's for this reason actually that in this position of the London, the most London aficionados actually play knight bd2 instead of c3, and they meet queen b6 with this very sharp line where they go d takes c5, and if queen takes b2, there's this whole mess with like rook b1, and the position's super theoretical. You can look into this if you're a London person. Coming back to the first position we looked at in this video though, I want to now introduce probably the most powerful way of addressing these queen attacks on b2 and b7, and that is just straight up ignoring it altogether. And in this position, we can see a very powerful example of doing so, where white just plays knight c3. The idea being that now if black takes a pawn, we're going to play knight takes d5, and not only did we win back a pawn in the process, but now there's this incredibly dangerous knight e7 threat, which black just has no way of dealing with. They go like knight e6, for example, we just take and go knight e7 check, goodbye to the black pieces. And even if they defend f6 in this position, this admittedly is not so straightforward. This is more of like a positional game we're playing now, where we play knight b5, we force black to go knight a6, and now essentially what white is saying is that, okay, our knight is very difficult to kick out from b5, because you play knight a6 blocking your a pawn from kicking it, and so essentially what we've made is a positional exchange, so to speak, where our knight in b5 is going to sit here as long as it's comfortable for doing so, and black's knight is also confined to sitting here for a6, because if it ever moves, trying to play a6 to kick our knight out, well again, that's going to lead to problems with knight 7 check. And for example, if they ever try to play c4 to kick our knight back like that, now we're going to play a4 and reinforce the knight like so, and again, it's still very difficult to kick out. c4 didn't solve any of black's problems whatsoever. And to briefly just show another example how this can maybe occur in practice, we can look at the French defense, the following moves, where f4 is technically the best move, but knight f3 is also sort of viable if you take on c5. What you don't want to allow, however, is them to take on d4, and then if you take back with the knight, they take on e5, because that pawn is very loose, and if you ever take back with the queen, then knight 6 gains a bunch of tempi, so you want to take on c5, releasing the tension, but then you sort of protect e5 with your pieces. And one important line is that if black plays queen b6 forking the f2 and b2 pawns, you can actually just castle, not give a crap if they take, because now again you get this familiar move knight b5, threatening this fork, and naturally if black castles, now you slap him in the face with a Greek skill sacrifice, and they're completely busted. Looking at a very different opening to like the London and Slav stuff we spent a lot of time looking at this video though, I want to briefly look at a very sharp line Sicilian knight, or the bishop g5 variation. We play all these natural moves, but now queen b6. This is known as a poison pawn variation, because very often, well, it's only a poison pawn if technically white plays something like queen d2 and allows black to take, and this is its whole line, right, where, you know, white allows black to take on b2 again, but then we play something like f5 or e5 and try to basically argue, black, you're way behind development, I don't really believe you can make this work. But the other idea I want to show is in this position after queen b6, sometimes you can play a move such as a3, which might look like a bit of a useless pawn move, but the idea is that tactically now, black cannot take on b2 because it actually just traps the queen after knight a4, and now white is basically winning. Granted, black does not have to take, they can play developing moves like, say, after a3, bishop e7, knight b7, and they're probably not doing too bad, but this is an idea worth remembering because it can crop up in a lot of openings, where again, we really are making the b2 pawn poisoned now in a real sense, because if they take it, again, they just lose their queen straight up, end of story. Looking at another e4 opening though, if we look at the Caro-Kann, there's also some situations where, say for example, when one side attacks the b2 pawn, that if that side gets too carried away, sort of taking material, eventually they can sort of end up in a situation, and by the way, e6 is a very important move in this position, stopping black from comfortably completing their own kingside development. But now what we have is a position where black is sort of being lured into taking our rook in the corner, but now we can play this move queen b3, and all of a sudden this guy, or gal rather, it's actually more accurate, is in a whole load of trouble, because her only way out is to take on d4, but in this position that doesn't quite work because queen takes b7, and all of a sudden this is a threat, and also queen c8 mate is also a threat. And that means that, okay, then you might have to play something like b6, but now knight f3, this guy's protected now, and essentially what's going to happen is white's going to castle, play knight bd2 next, trap the queen, and yes, you can take and get 2 rooks for the queen, but look at the rest of your position. It's absolute garbage. You have weaknesses all over the place, your king has no good shelter, how are you developing this guy? Not clear at all, which is why backing off, coming all the way back to this position, right, black has to be incredibly careful about taking pawns like b2, and furthermore taking on a1, because if you're not, you might just end up with your queen trapped in the corner. But finally, the sort of last common way you can really ignore, let's say, an attack on the b7 pawn, looking at the Caro-Kann, where we go for this sort of mainline exchange variation. Black usually defends with the move queen d7, not quite ignoring it, but you'll see what I mean in a second, where we're heading with, where now in this position, black sort of has 2 moves, either to play bishop e7, or actually just move bishop d6. And it might sort of be like, whoa, what's going on here, right? Like, after takes, we're hanging b7, aren't we? But this is where things aren't so simple, and that you realize after like even the smallest amount of calculation that we can probably play rook b8, and at some point maybe take on b2. And now the engine's actually suggesting this position that we castle first and only later try to take on b2. But the point remains, right, that very often we can give up a pawn on b7 like this, get counterplay in the b file, and maybe take back a pawn like this very simply, and sort of punish the opponent for once again getting a little bit greedy, and as a result having to waste a lot of time later on when the queen gets sort of chased around like the a6 and whatnot. But to finish off, using everything we've learned so far in this video, I'd like to give you guys some exercises to really consolidate the sort of stuff that we've learned. So here's the first position. Try and think about in this position, what would you play as black? Pause the video and come back. And again, in this position, black should, as best as possible, try to avoid playing a move such as b6. This is, of course, again, just generally speaking, way too weakening. The best move is rather queen b6. And again, if white takes, then we take back to the a pawn, and if they take on d5, we're not going to be taking with the c pawn. Well, we could technically, but much rather what we'd prefer to do is take with the knight and sort of maintain this pawn unit, so to speak, and not create a weakness on like the b5 square. Also possible is instead of queen b6, maybe queen c8, and a little bit more passive. And one thing you have to watch out for in such scenarios is eventually like a rook coming to the c file, putting pressure along here. But queen c8 is not the worst move in the world. There also is queen c7 technically, but I prefer queen c8 a little bit more to queen c7, because when you put the queen on this square, you are potentially opening yourself up to being attacked with tempo by a move such as bishop f4 later down the road. So again, another situation where our pawn on b7 is being attacked. Try and think about how you would respond to this threat. And so again, for the millionth time in this video, I would hope you guys are not playing b6. In general, a very weakening move. Very few cases in which this is actually the best move for black. Something like queen c8 is also possible, but again, this is a little bit passive. If you have to go for it, okay, it's not the end of the world. But what is much stronger in this position, again, as I talked about, if you have a way of ignoring the pawn attack, that is usually going to be your best solution in the position. And what black can do here is actually counterattack the d4 pawn with knight c6. If white takes it, knight takes d4, we're all of a sudden very active. Knight c2 is also a threat that white needs to be careful of. If they try to say in this position play d5 to attack our knight, we can go knight d4, and again they have to not only address the attack on the queen but also keep an eye on the c2 square, so they probably cannot take this. They have to go backwards, but after something like bishop g7, and say if they play like bishop e3, we can probably just play c5 and reinforce the knight here. If they take, we can take back, and this looks like a fine position for the black pieces where we have an active bishop, a long-term central majority, and so that maybe leaves bishop e3 as the most critical move, defending this while also still keeping an eye on the b7 pawn. But here black actually just still plays bishop g7, reinforcing the pressure on d4. So if white takes, we still take, and if they say play d5, again we're going to play knight d4. And if they try to take and then go take some b7, we go rook b8, and this time white is actually in serious trouble because they can give a check, but it's very difficult to hold together this guy if they go knight c3 takes and their position is falling apart. And for the final exercise of this video, again, try and figure out how do you defend the b7 pawn. And so as we've talked about several times throughout the video, again, you generally want to avoid this structure. White generally has a pretty easy slight advantage in this sort of position. You also want to avoid going something like to c8, because in this case that just hangs the pawn, in addition to being very passive. Maybe there's even knight b5 even, but knight takes d5 seems at the very least like something the white has at their disposal. You also don't want to go to d7, because then something like knight f3, quick knight e5, bishop b5 is going to hit hard. Of course, as I said throughout the video multiple times, you don't want to play b6 again, incredibly passive. And so what does that leave, you might be asking? Like, surely not bishop c8, that's always a pretty bad idea. Or I mean, at the very least, if you do have to play a move like this, you kind of do have to question your life's purpose. But what black does have in this position is a move that I have not really talked about in this video. This is very much like the test in high school where your teacher gave you a question that you're like, but that wasn't on the practice test, and your teacher's like, well, I don't really care, use a brain and figure it out. And that's sort of what I'm doing here, where black's best move is to play knight a5, using the knight to actively counterattack the queen while also simultaneously protect b7. And when white gives a check, now we bring our bishop backwards, and after queen c2 we go e6, and now we smoothly complete our development with moves such as rook c8, bishop e7, castles, and roughly speaking, the position is around equal. Alright, but that's all I have to say for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel also for more content like this. And also, if you're interested in some of my other stuff, I have a free newsletter which you can have the link to in the description below, and also coaching for those who are interested in really taking their game to the next level. But with that being said, hope you guys all have a good day, and I will see you until next time.